It was a bright Sunday morning in the summer of 1899, and the bell of the little wooden church had just finished ringing. Families stepped out into the warm light, the men adjusting their coats, the women lifting parasols to shield their faces, and children laughing as they tugged at one another's hands. The congregation was proud of their small community, proud of their church, and proud to stand together for what they thought would be an ordinary photograph. The photographer, Elias Marlowe, carefully adjusted his heavy tripod, calling for everyone to stay still. He lifted the black cloth over his head, checked the focus, and prepared the glass plate. For a moment the crowd grew quiet, holding their breath as time stood still. It was meant to be a simple picture of faith and family at the end of a century, nothing more than a memory captured on glass. At first glance, that is exactly what the photograph seems to be. Rows of familiar faces look forward, frozen in time, their smiles as sharp today as they were more than 100 years ago. But when eyes wander to the background, to the shadows in the open doorway of the church, something strange appears. There, standing apart from the crowd, is a figure. It is tall and thin, almost skeletal in its posture, with its shoulders drawn inward as if weighed down by something unseen. The details are blurred, as though the shadow itself resisted being captured, yet the outline is undeniable. Some who study the photograph insist it looks like a man, dressed in outdated clothes, with long arms hanging loosely at his sides. Others argue it does not look like any man at all, the form too distorted, too unnatural to belong to a living person. The figure does not smile, it does not pose, it does not even seem to share the moment with the congregation. Instead, it waits, silent, motionless, and unervingly still. It stares out from the threshold of the church, as if watching both the photographer and those around him. In later years, when descendants of the families gathered that morning were shown the picture, they pointed out their grandparents and relatives without hesitation. But when their eyes reached the figure in the doorway, every one of them denied knowing who it was. The stories that followed only deepened the mystery. Some swore that no one had been standing in the doorway that day, that every member of the congregation was already outside when the photographer arranged the group. Others said the figure looked too tall, too pale, or too shapeless to belong to anyone they recognized. Rumors spread, as they always do, and soon the figure became the center of whispered tales. A few claimed it looked like a man who had died years earlier, one who had never found rest. Others insisted the photograph had caught something not entirely human, a shadow of the past that appeared only when the shutter opened. Still, the image remained, sharp and unexplainable, a puzzle for anyone willing to look closely. Some said it was nothing more than a trick of the light, an illusion created by the doorway's dark interior. Yet others could not shake the feeling that the figure was real, that it had stood among them, watching unseen until the photograph revealed it. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Elias Marlowe was a careful man, known for taking multiple pictures whenever possible, and that Sunday was no different. He prepared a second plate only moments after the first, adjusting his angle slightly to ensure the scene was preserved in case one exposure failed. The crowd remained in place, their poses nearly identical, their faces calm and unchanged. When the two photographs are placed side by side, a chilling detail emerges. In the first image, the shadowed figure is there, standing in the doorway, silent and still. But in the second photograph, taken less than a minute later, the doorway is empty. Nothing has changed among the congregation. No one has shifted, no one has moved, no smiles have faded. Yet the figure has vanished without a trace. There is no blur, no faint outline to suggest someone stepping away, no sign of movement at all. It is simply gone, as if it had never been there. Some who looked closely even claimed the shadows in the doorway appeared darker in the second image, as if something had been taken away, leaving only emptiness behind. And the most unsettling part is this: not a single person present that day remembered seeing anyone leave. The man behind the camera that day was Elias Marlowe, a traveling portrait artist who moved from town to town capturing the lives of people in rural America. He was not famous, but he was known for his patience, his steady hand, and his dedication to preserving the simple faces of forgotten communities. Families often paid him in coins, meals, or even livestock, and in return he gave them something far rarer than money, a moment in time fixed forever. He carried his camera across endless fields and dusty roads, setting it up in barns, on porches, and in front of churches like the one in 1899. His work was careful and exact, the mark of a man who took pride in the honesty of his craft. People who knew him said Elias never rushed, never cut corners, and always treated each photograph as though it might outlive every soul in the frame. That day at the church was no different. He prepared his plates, checked his light, and wrote his usual notes. By all accounts, it should have been just another job. Elias kept a journal, neat and orderly, filled with the details of his travels. He wrote down names, dates, exposure times, and even the weather conditions. In some entries he included sketches, small doodles of the towns he visited or the children he photographed. When researchers later studied his writings, they found nothing unusual in the pages about the church photograph. The notes from that Sunday were short, ordinary, and without emotion. Clear sky, good light, congregation outside church, 2 plates. That was all he recorded. There was no mention of the shadow, no remark about a figure in the doorway, nothing at all to suggest he noticed anything strange. And yet the figure is there, sharp and undeniable, as real as every child smiling in the front row. It is almost as though Elias himself had not seen what the camera revealed. Or perhaps he had seen it, and chose not to write it down. His camera was large and heavy, built for precision but demanding in its use. It stood on a wooden tripod, its black bellows stretching like the ribs of some mechanical beast. To take a picture, Elias would prepare a fragile glass plate coated in chemicals sensitive to light. Every step required patience. Setting the plate, adjusting the focus beneath the dark cloth, calculating the seconds needed for exposure. A mistake could ruin the image, wasting both time and costly materials. For this reason, experts decades later insisted that Elias could not have made a careless error. The figure in the doorway was captured as cleanly as the rest of the group. Historians studied the negatives under magnification, searching for scratches, double exposures, or any sign of tampering. They found none. The photograph was genuine in every way, untouched and honest. And yet, it showed something that should not have been there. The figure is as clear as every other member of the congregation. And yet, it does not appear again. This detail troubled those who examined his work, because Elias was too consistent, too deliberate to allow for accidents. If the shadowed figure had been a trick of light or a fault in the plate, it would not have appeared so solid, so defined, so disturbingly human. The silence of his journal only deepened the unease. Why had he ignored what was plain to see? Some believed he never noticed, that his eyes and mind focused only on the families he posed in the foreground. Others suggested he had noticed, but chose to deny it, as though putting it into words would give the thing more power. Whatever the truth, Elias carried his camera onward, to the next town, and then the next, always moving, always recording, as though he were running from something unseen. 3 years after the photograph at the church, Elias Marlowe vanished. In the spring of 1902, he was last seen boarding a wagon headed toward another rural parish. His belongings were found neatly packed in a rented room, his journal lying open on a table. The entry from his final day was short, shaky, and unlike his usual calm handwriting. It read, "Shadow at the door again. Waiting. Follows from town to town." There were no more pages after that. Elias was never found, and no trace of him ever appeared in the records again. To some, his disappearance was nothing more than the fate of a wanderer, lost to the roads or the wilderness. To others, it was proof that the photograph had marked the beginning of something darker, a haunting that traveled with him until it finally claimed him. Those who look back on his story now cannot help but wonder if Elias knew more than he ever admitted. Perhaps he had seen the figure in other doorways, in other towns, and had kept silent until the shadows grew too close. Perhaps the photograph was not a mistake, but a warning, a glimpse of the presence that followed him from place to place. And perhaps the last thing Elias Marlowe ever saw was not a familiar church or a familiar road, but that same dark silhouette, standing silently in the threshold, waiting for him to look its way. The church at the center of the story was not a new building in 1899. It had been standing for 25 years, built in 1874 by the hands of farmers, carpenters, and their families. At first it seemed like a symbol of hope, a place of worship that would anchor the community. But the land it was built on carried older stories, ones that some believed had never truly been buried. Records from the county courthouse showed that the ground was once used as a burial site for travelers who had died passing through, people with no family to claim them. Simple wooden crosses had marked their graves, most of which had decayed by the time the church was raised. Not everyone agreed the land should be disturbed, but the parish leaders pressed on, eager to replace forgotten graves with a house of prayer. That decision, many would later whisper, cursed the ground from the very first stone. The disputes over the land stretched back to the beginning. Neighbors argued about strange sicknesses that spread soon after the church was finished, and some claimed livestock refused to graze near the edge of the property. There were whispers of accidents during construction, of men injured by falling beams or tools that slipped without reason. In official records, the church was described as blessed, a shining mark of faith in the wilderness. But in hushed voices, locals said it was built on unrest, a sacred place standing on soil that did not want it. As the years passed, attendance remained steady, yet the shadow of unease never left. Even those who went every Sunday admitted later that the church had always felt heavy, as if something unseen lingered at its threshold. By the 1880s, rumors began to take shape into stories. Parishioners spoke of a presence that lingered near the doorway, watching silently as services began and ended. At first, no one dared to say the words aloud, but eventually children whispered about the figure they saw when the evening light fell across the steps. They claimed it was tall, with long arms and a head that tilted unnaturally, a silhouette that vanished the moment anyone walked near. Adults dismissed these tales as childish fears, yet the children's stories never faded. Over time, even grown men admitted to feeling uneasy when stepping through the entrance. Some reported the sensation of being observed, of eyes pressing into their backs as they walked in. Others swore they caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, only for it to vanish before they could look twice. The figure became part of the folklore of the town, something never spoken of in daylight but always present in thought. They gave it a name whispered among the pews and behind closed doors: the Door Sentinel. The title carried a mix of fear and respect, as though the figure had claimed the threshold as its own. They called it the Door Sentinel, a presence no one dared confront. To some, it was a spirit bound to the graves beneath the church, forever keeping watch. To others, it was a warning, a reminder that not every soul could cross into holy ground. Whether ghost, shadow, or something stranger, the figure belonged to the doorway, and the doorway belonged to it. And so the stories grew, feeding on every glance, every shiver, and every service where the entrance seemed darker than it should have been. In later years, a discovery was made that breathed new life into the legend. Among the church's old records, tucked away in a chest of papers, researchers found the private notes of Reverend Samuel Price, who had led the parish from 1878 until his death in the early 1900s. Price was known in his lifetime as a kind man, respected for his sermons and his dedication to his flock. Yet his journals revealed a side of him that was far less calm. In neat handwriting, he described visions that repeated themselves week after week. "At the doorway," he wrote, "there stands one who will not come in. I see him at dusk. I see him at dawn. He does not move, he does not speak, but I know he is there." The Reverend never shared these thoughts from the pulpit, but in his private pages he confessed to fearing the figure. He believed it was a lost soul, bound to the church but barred from entering, forever caught between the world of the living and the grace of God. The pastor's words carried a sense of quiet dread, as though he believed the shadow at the doorway was not only real but eternal. He admitted that he sometimes avoided looking directly at the entrance when leading prayer, afraid that locking eyes with the figure might invite something he could not control. His journals grew darker in tone as the years went on, describing sleepless nights and the feeling of being watched, even when alone. One line in particular still unsettles those who read it today. "He waits at the door, and he waits for me." Some say the Reverend went to his grave haunted, never able to shake the belief that the church was guarded or cursed by a presence no prayer could drive away. His notes ended abruptly in 1901, the year before Elias Marlowe vanished. By then, the figure in the doorway had already become more than just a story. It had become part of the church itself, a shadow carved into its very history. More than a century after the photograph was taken, historians and experts finally had the chance to study it with tools that Elias Marlowe could never have imagined. The glass plate, though fragile, had survived, stored in a family trunk until it was donated to a local archive. With digital scanners and computer programs, specialists enhanced every detail of the image, sharpening faces and shadows to a clarity beyond what the human eye had once seen. Families appeared with startling realism, their expressions frozen in a moment of pride and simplicity. But when the doorway was magnified, the details only deepened the mystery. The figure's face, once thought to be nothing more than a blur, revealed something far more unsettling. The cheeks looked hollow, as though starved, and the eyes appeared black and sunken, with no visible light reflecting in them at all. The clothing was equally strange, dark and loose, not matching the fashion of 1899 but resembling something older, ragged, and misplaced in time. The experts debated what this meant. Some argued that the figure was simply blurred by shadow, an illusion caused by poor lighting. Yet the longer they studied it, the harder it became to accept such a simple answer. The figure was too sharp, too well defined, standing as solidly as the children in the front row. Every detail seemed intentional, captured by the same lens and the same exposure as the rest of the congregation. What unsettled the researchers most was the texture of the image. Where others in the photo showed skin and fabric with the grain of reality, the figure seemed almost thinner, as if the light itself resisted capturing it. The lines of its body dissolved toward the edges, blending into the dark frame of the doorway. The figure seemed more transparent than solid, as if the light itself resisted capturing it. The photograph, enhanced to the limits of technology, raised more questions than answers. The investigators then turned their attention to the families who had stood in front of the church that day. Many of their descendants still lived in the region, and some had inherited not just the photograph, but the stories that followed it. Interviews revealed a series of strange and unsettling accounts. Several families spoke of illnesses that swept through their households shortly after the photograph was taken. Perfectly healthy men and women became weak within weeks, some dying before the year ended. Doctors of the time called it pneumonia or influenza, but the timing led some to believe the sickness was tied to something darker. Other families told of sudden accidents, fires, falls, or unexplained deaths that seemed to follow those captured closest to the doorway in the image. Whether coincidence or curse, the photograph appeared to leave a shadow on more than just glass. One story stood out above the rest. A boy who had been 10 years old in the photograph grew up to live a long but troubled life. According to his grandchildren, he often spoke of recurring dreams that began shortly after that Sunday in 1899. In those dreams, he said, the church doorway never stood empty. A tall figure waited there, night after night, silent and unmoving, always watching him. The man claimed the dreams followed him into adulthood, haunting him well into old age. Even when he moved away, hundreds of miles from the small town, the dreams did not stop. He described the figure as patient, as though it had all the time in the world, and he feared that one day it would step closer. His family remembered these stories not as the ramblings of an old man, but as memories told with a seriousness that chilled them. Other descendants added their own uneasy accounts. Some swore the photograph was never kept in their homes for long. Whenever it was hung on a wall, strange things happened. Knocks at night, doors opening without wind, and sudden drafts of cold air moving through sealed rooms. A few families even claimed to hear faint whispers whenever the photograph was nearby, words too soft to understand but heavy with intent. For this reason, many passed it along quickly, never keeping it for more than a generation. The glass plate itself moved from trunk to trunk, family to family, until it was finally given away to the archive, as though no one wanted the burden of holding it anymore. By the late 20th century, interest in the photograph grew among paranormal researchers. The church itself had fallen into ruin, abandoned after a fire in the 1940s, left only its foundation and partial walls. Yet, even in its broken state, people claimed the ground carried an unnatural weight. Ghost hunters began visiting the site, drawn by the story of the vanishing figure. They brought their recorders, cameras, and instruments, hoping to capture proof of what the old photograph suggested. Many of their visits ended in disappointment, but some left with evidence that could not be easily dismissed. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVPs, picked up faint whispers near the doorway, voices too soft for the ear but clear when played back. Some phrases seemed to form words, others were nothing more than low murmurs, but all came from the same spot, the entrance where the figure once stood. Temperature readings added another layer to the mystery. On calm summer nights, investigators recorded sudden drops in heat as they stepped through the threshold. The air outside remained warm, but inside the doorway, the cold clung to them like breath from an unseen mouth. Photographs taken with modern cameras occasionally showed strange distortions. Blurs, streaks, or faint outlines. None as clear as the original, but enough to stir unease. Even skeptics admitted the location carried an atmosphere that was hard to explain. Some reported feeling watched, as though standing on the same spot placed them under a gaze that had lingered for more than a century. The church ruins became a quiet destination for those drawn to the paranormal. Some visitors left quickly, unable to stand the silence of the empty land. Others lingered, waiting for something to appear in the shadows. While no figure has ever been captured again as clearly as in 1899, many believe the doorway still holds its sentinel. One paranormal team, after hours of fruitless waiting, prepared to leave. But as they packed their equipment, one member glanced back at the doorway and froze. For a split second, he swore he saw a tall figure standing there, half swallowed by darkness, watching them. When the others turned, the space was empty. The man never returned to the site again. The doorway still refuses to remain empty. When the two photographs are placed side by side, the sequence becomes impossible to ignore. In the first, the congregation stands proud, their faces turned toward the lens, their expressions captured with perfect clarity. Behind them, in the doorway of the church, the shadowed figure stands tall, silent, and undeniable. Only seconds later, the second plate reveals the same scene, nearly identical in every detail. The children still hold hands, the women still raise their parasols, the men still keep their solemn stares. Yet the doorway is empty, stripped of its strange occupant. No movement is visible, no blur of departure, no trace of a body passing through. It is as though the figure never left. It simply ceased to be, vanishing between one heartbeat and the next. This timeline has been studied by countless researchers, all struggling to explain the disappearance. If the figure were a man, he would have needed to step forward or turn away, actions that the camera would have surely captured. But no such motion exists. The photographs are still, frozen in perfect balance, unchanged except for the absence of the doorway figure. Some argued it might have been a trick of light, a shape caused by shadows and the uneven wood of the entrance. But when examined closely, the figure is too detailed to be a shadow. It has shoulders, arms, and a face marked by darkness. The shadow excuse collapses the longer one stares. The figure was there and then it was gone. Nothing can change that. The first theory many considered was that of a double exposure. In photography of that era, it was possible for an image to overlap if the glass plate was used improperly. Yet experts who studied the negatives dismissed this idea. A double exposure leaves patterns, ghost-like blurs, or repeated details, none of which appear in Marlowe's work. The figure is as sharp as any other subject in the first image, and completely absent in the second. The negatives tell a story of precision, not error. This was no accident of chemicals or careless handling. Something had truly changed in that brief span of seconds, and no technical explanation could account for it. Another theory suggested the figure was simply an unrecorded stranger, a man who happened to linger in the doorway before slipping away unnoticed. But this explanation fails under scrutiny. Every person in the photograph was later identified by families in the town, every face accounted for, every name matched to the community. There was no stranger in the group that day, no one missing from the records. And even if a man had been present, how could he vanish so completely, leaving not even the faintest suggestion of movement? A doorway is narrow. To leave it would require stepping into view, yet no one recalled such a step and no camera captured it. The stranger theory answers nothing, it only avoids the truth. For believers in the paranormal, the explanation was clear. The figure was no ordinary man but an entity tied to the church itself. Some saw it as the restless ghost of those buried before the foundation was laid, a soul unable to pass into peace. Others believed it was something far older, something that had claimed the threshold as its own, neither inside nor outside, forever bound to the space between. In this theory, the photograph had not revealed a man, but a haunting presence that chose to show itself only when the shutter opened. It had been there long before the photograph, and it remains there still, a sentinel watching over the entrance. A final possibility offered by researchers was that the image captured a time slip, a fragment of the past bleeding into the present. In this explanation, the figure was not part of 1899 at all but a trace from another moment, a replay of someone who once stood in the same doorway decades earlier. The church, standing on ground already filled with restless history, might have carried the imprint of those who passed before. The photograph, in that fleeting second, could have opened a window into a moment that did not belong. In this view, the figure was never truly there with the congregation. It was a shadow of another time, caught by chance and erased just as quickly. In the end, the theories bring only more questions. None explain the full truth, and none erase the unsettling power of the image itself. The figure remains as real today as the moment Elias Marlowe captured it, staring out from the shadows, daring us to explain it away. The photograph becomes more than history. It becomes a confrontation with the unknown, a reminder that even the most ordinary moments can hold something unearthly just beyond our sight. Perhaps the people of that Sunday morning never saw it, perhaps Elias chose not to speak of it, but the camera saw. And once it was seen, it could never be forgotten. The photograph is now more than an artifact. It is a warning, a window, a story carved into silver and shadow. For over a century, it has drawn eyes to the doorway, forcing every viewer to face the same silent question. What stood there watching, in the summer of 1899? We may never know if it was a man, a spirit, or something stranger still. But one thought lingers long after the image is put away, the words echoing like a whisper from the threshold. Perhaps the photograph did not capture the figure at all. Perhaps it simply allowed us to see what had always been waiting at the church door.